Good evening. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History here at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our conversation this evening. My thanks as well to Epicenter for co-sponsoring tonight's event, and of course to the Graduate Center's Office of Public Programs. This event has been a long time coming. When the pandemic first began, Rob called me up to ask what I had planned. I answered that I thought we ought to convene historians, cultural institutions, and have a conversation about what we could do to contribute to documenting the event, to helping somehow in the crisis. We found to our very pleasant surprise that many organizations were already ahead of us and swung into action. You're going to hear about some of that work tonight. At the Gotham Center, we set up a directory, oral histories, memorials, exhibits, films, and other projects, and we launched one of the first podcasts to chronicle the COVID-19 pandemic in New York. We use CUNY as our focus, reasoning that few institutions are so representative of the city, with 25 campuses reaching into every corner of the 5 boroughs with 250,000 new students every year. Reviewing those episodes for tonight's event was an unwelcome flashback. COVID-19 was frightening, it was heartbreaking, and it was also maddening. But tonight is about honoring the people who emerged as unlikely media heroes in those years, the essential workers. Some had jobs we are used to hearing journalists and politicians praise for their service: firefighters, police, nurses. Many others were not. They were bus drivers, 911 operators, 911 operators, janitors, deliverymen, caretakers, men and women who are normally underpaid, who are normally underrespected, and too often underpaid. Asked or forced during the crisis to hold the system together, to put their mental and their physical health at risk, while the rest of us stayed at home and Zoomed. Their stories are, quote, a record of courage, heartache, strength, wisdom, and compassion, as our speaker tonight describes them. I would add, too, that they should also remind us that while, for example, the number of millionaires in the country doubled during the pandemic, essential workers came out with no compensation for their service. So that's hardly a legacy worth honoring, and I hope tonight can be a very small way of saying thank you to those people. With that said, I'll briefly introduce our speakers and then shuffle off stage. Rob Snyder is, and for the last 5 years has been, the official borough historian of Manhattan, appointed by the former borough president Gail Brewer. He is professor emeritus of American Studies and Journalism at Rutgers University and has published widely on New York City's history, from transit workers to vaudeville, immigration, and the Ashcan artists. His last book, Crossing Broadway, was a study of Washington Heights, the neighborhood in which he grew up. And in between all the volunteer work he has done as Manhattan Borough historian, he's also begun a project researching the life of Murray Kempton, the Pulitzer-winning mid-century journalist at the Post. Mitra Kalita is a veteran journalist, media executive, prolific commentator, and the author of 2 books. In 2020, she launched Epicenter-NYC, a newsletter to help New Yorkers get through the pandemic. Mitra has also recently co-founded a new media company called URL Media, a network of Black and Brown-owned media organizations that share content, distribution, and revenues to increase their long-term sustainability. She's on the board of the Philadelphia Inquirer and writes a weekly column for Time Magazine and Charter. Mitra was most recently SVP at CNN Digital, overseeing the national news, breaking news, programming opinion, and feature items. I'm delighted they could join us this evening, and I hope you will join me in welcoming them with some applause.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks all of you for being with us tonight. This is a great crowd, and those of you who are watching on Zoom, thank you for tuning in as well. I just want to pick up on 2 words Peter said, which was thank you to our essential workers. And I think it's worth, we'll talk about where we each were 5 years ago, but if you could just take a moment and put yourself to, this month or maybe a few weeks ago, 5 years ago, in the role that essential workers played in our lives, but also just your life. I think it's just worth kind of entering this conversation with that reflection and with that gratitude. So just take a moment and indulge me, if you will. And that, I think, segues me to ask Rob, what inspired this book? Why essential workers and this book?
When COVID broke, I was a brand new borough historian, and I started getting questions about the virus. And I didn't know anything about the virus. I didn't know anything about medicine. I didn't know anything about public health. So I started to assemble some advisors. David Rosner at the Mailman School of Public Health, Janet Golden, who recently retired from Rutgers. Both of them were historians of medicine. So I could get advice from them and then refer reporters' questions to them so they could get some solid information out about the pandemic. That early set of advisors grew into a larger group of historians, folklorists, archivists who met over Zoom with the help from Peter and the Gotham Center to swap ideas about what we might do to document the pandemic. Josh Brown, who worked here at CUNY for many years, said accurately, this is going to be as big as the Great Depression, we should do something. And we talked a lot about doing a big website that would document everything we were learning, but in the end, that was too expensive, too complicated, and I decided that I would think about doing something on my own that would be some kind of book that would draw on the tremendous resources that all these universities, libraries, and archives were pulling together during the pandemic.
And just give me a sense of that time frame. Was this in the spring of 2020, or what?
Spring and early summer. By the summer, it was underway, but it started in the spring, and it really was taking off by June.
And so what does that look like? Because I think we all felt we were in history, and yet what I love about the way you render this work is that it's sweeping, and yet it's very intimate, right? So I think that's intentional, but how do you go about doing that?
I read and studied hundreds of interviews, maybe 400, and my editor at Cornell University Press said, this book doesn't have to have an argument, but it has to have a frame that makes everything hold together. And as I read the interviews, I was struck again and again by three things. People suffered, people coped, and people worked. And it was the people who worked, who went out as essential workers, who struck me as the really important people who weren't normally being heard from in this episode and who needed to be part of the record for posterity.
I wondered if we could just kind of take your lens as a historian and talk a little bit about oral history and the role that played in both your interview process and assembling this work. And I'll just say my own background with oral history. So I attended Rutgers University, which has one of the best oral history departments in the country. I mean, it really was something we were very proud of. And then years after I graduated, an oral historian called and asked me if I could sit with him and talk about the years I was on campus where there was a lot of unrest over our president making some comments that were linking SAT scores and the race of some students. As you might imagine, that did not go down well. And so I, as a journalist, suddenly found myself on the other side of the mic, and I didn't realize oral history is hours and hours and hours of your life. I mean, I just didn't know this, right? And so I will say, as a journalist, it changed my practice of journalism because of the level of, and you're nodding, I mean, this is where I'm just like, how do you do, like, because for me, I didn't realize, oh, they're gonna ask me about everything, right? Like, everything, and like what you read that day, what you ate that day. And then as someone who eventually went on to write 2 books, I kind of got it, right? Because we're a product of so much in our environment, and I see people nodding, which means there's probably historians in the audience. Where does that come from, and what is that like a practice that's been honed? Is that something that you do? Tell me about oral history as you practice it.
So I've been fascinated by both journalism and oral and history for all my life. And I got into oral history because it seemed to be at the intersection of the two. It was interviewing people like a journalist, but it was also about the past and looking at their life. And what I learned about oral history interviews, in contrast to journalistic interviews, at least most journalistic interviews, is that in an oral history interview, you ask the questions and you let the person talk and let them go where they want to go. And what they want to say and what they want to lay out for you is every bit as important as your right to ask the question. There's a kind of shared authority that's at work there. So in an oral history interview, you can often get much deeper into somebody's life and somebody's perspective. Ron Greeley, who taught me oral history at Rutgers Newark, said, ask the question and then shut up. That's it. Let them talk until they're done, and then ask a good follow-up question that takes them further.
Yeah, and I will say that the process just kind of comes full circle. Over the last year or so, I've been doing this with my father and his generation of immigrants, and just sort of let them go. And this is over the last 18 months. 2 of those people have passed away, and at their funerals, the children have come to me and said, could we play excerpts of those interviews, right? And so there's something about what you're saying, which is letting people tell their own version of history, that as a journalist, it's what I thought that's what we do, but we don't really just let people go. We kind of go in with a set of questions. I'm guilty tonight. And so that process, I think also of, this I think segues us to essential workers, which is that the framework, and you mentioned the framework of the book, you know, there are heroes that you've declared here. So tell me a little bit about that declaration, and then take us into the world, seeing this perhaps, you know, invisible labor or uncelebrated aspect of our labor market. I just want to dive into that agency over storytelling.
So all my life as a historian, and really in the journalism that I've done too, I've always been committed to the idea of history from the bottom up, history from the perspective of ordinary people who do the work and often get ignored. And I made one promise to myself in this book, that I was going to allow people who had not been heard from to speak through the book. That to get into this book, one of the prerequisites was you couldn't be famous already. So you wouldn't have mayors, and you wouldn't have elected officials, and you wouldn't have prominent physicians. You would have people that most folks had never even heard from before, right? So that helped me there. The second thing was, I figured out pretty quickly that there were so many different ways of experiencing COVID in New York City. There were people who moved to country houses. There were people who hid in the back of the apartment, the way I did. And then there were people who went out and worked. And one of my grad school advisors, Tom Bender, said if New York is ever going to have any kind of constructive, collective response to COVID, people are going to have to increase their stock of empathy. They're going to have to understand the experiences of people whose lives during COVID were very different from their own. So I selected interviews and poems and narratives in the end that would introduce readers to very different experiences and very different perspectives.
So let's give the audience a little bit of a taste of what we're talking about. I just wondered if you wanted to start with the reading that gives us a little of how that storytelling went down.
Sure. So I am really honored tonight that some of the contributors are among us, and one of them is a fellow named Phil Suarez, who's
Phil,
in
are
the
you here?
MT.
Oh, front row, all right.
And here are his comments about the toughest day he had in April of 2020. My worst day was April 6th or something like that. In one day, I had a 15-year-old, a 25-year-old, a 42-year-old, and a 56-year-old in cardiac arrest. And they all died, except for the 25-year-old. The 15-year-old was difficult, but I knew she wasn't going to make it. It was 6 a.m. I logged onto our computer in the ambulance, and we get what's called a sprint, basically a transcription of the 911 call. And it says 15-year-old cardiac arrest, CPR in progress by family. And I told the dispatcher, You're reading the same thing as I'm reading. It's a child in cardiac arrest. Can you send me somebody? I'm coming from a distance. I'm coming from Manhattan. And they're like, you're solo. Do your best. So we hauled over there to the Bronx. It's a 5th floor walk up. We load up 50 pounds of gear, go up 5 flights of stairs. And at that point, fire got there, and she was asystolic. Her heart had stopped beating. We tried to work her up. I was very aggressive, obviously. And the best we got was a PEA, a pulseless electrical activity, briefly. Then she went right back into asystolic. I knew there was nothing more I could have done, but it's still 15 years old. Obviously, it weighs very heavily on anyone, and the family was there. It was just very, very traumatic. But the rest of the day didn't get any better. And oddly enough, 3 of them that I had, they had the same scenario. They had these low symptoms, and they were about to go into the shower, and then they went into cardiac arrest. And all of a sudden, they would just drop dead. And this 25-year-old was the same thing. It was bizarre. I don't know why. The 25-year-old, he had just gone down. I wanted to give him every possible chance. So I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do an endotracheal intubation, insert a tube into his windpipe to deliver oxygen, which is riskier, obviously. And we worked him up for about 15 minutes and got him back. How we did, I don't know. It was just too many patients to follow up on. But I think it was pretty promising. But I unfortunately don't know his final outcome. I hope it was good. I told myself that it was maybe good. So that was my worst day. I was averaging about 3 cardiac arrests a shift, which is unprecedented. That day was 4, but that day made it worse. Just the ages. It was such young people. And that just puts a lot into perspective. It's so frustrating to read and to hear what we hear, knowing what we saw and witnessed.
Thank you. And can we get a round of applause for Phil? So tell us how that interview came about. How did you meet Phil, and how did you get that story out of him?
I didn't do that interview. Actually, that was one of the interviews done by the Columbia Oral History Project. And that was one of the interviews that they did with folks who were in and around Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center, New York Presbyterian Medical Center in Washington Heights. So they gave me access to their interviews, and that was one of the ones that I sifted out. I did interviews of my own, too, to cover holes in the collection of interviews, particularly with transit workers. I was really bothered that was so little attention being paid to transit workers for a couple of reasons. 1, my grandfather was a transit worker. 2, I'd written a book about transit workers. And I knew that early in the pandemic, the transit workers complained to the transit authority that they were being asked to work under unsafe conditions. And the transit authority was slow to respond to their grievances and legitimate demands for safer working conditions. So I went out of my way to interview transit workers as well.
And the writing of this book, because it's pulled from a few different places, what were some of the inspirations for that? What did you read as you were putting this together?
Early on, when the pandemic was breaking and we were all talking about our responses and we were comparing it to the Great Depression, I thought about a whole series of books and oral histories done by an organization called the Federal Writers Project. It was established during the New Deal. It was part of the New Deal agencies, and it had 2 purposes. One was to shine a good spotlight on some of the works of the New Deal, but the other was to strengthen Americans in the Great Depression by introducing them to their own history, to their own culture, and to people who are often overlooked, forgotten men and women. For example, they would do oral history interviews with elderly people who had been enslaved before the Civil War in their childhood. They would do interviews with workers. They would do photographs of sharecroppers. It inspired lots of work down the road, like the famous book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, and the great book about the Great Depression, Hard Times, by Studs Terkel. And it's really, in some ways, Studs Terkel's Hard Times, an oral history of the Great Depression, that got me thinking about doing a collection of interviews in this book. There's another book as well. It was by Marc Bloch, a great French historian. It's called Strange Defeat. He was a distinguished historian of medieval France. When World War II broke out, he served in the French army. He witnessed the French defeat firsthand, and he went into the French resistance. But he also wrote a book trying to explain how and why France was defeated so badly in World War II. And here I was in New York City, a city with a famous collection of hospitals, a famous public health department, and yet we were doing really badly in COVID. What could I contribute, I thought, that would do for COVID something of what Marx Bloch's book had done for France in World War II?
Yeah, the book I told you that reminded me of what you set out to do here was Chernobyl. I don't know if I'm getting the title right. What, is it Chernobyl? Is it just called Chernobyl? Yeah. And before I traveled to Russia a few years ago, ironically working on some democracy building exercises with media before we're at where we're at. A bunch of people told me to read it just to understand this country. And I was like, okay, and I just found myself, and then of course, those of you who might be familiar, there was a mini-series that came out based on this oral history, which was like, the book is as cinematic. And it's just interesting to hear your examples because they're from war or rebuilding. And with COVID, I'm wondering, do you feel like, A, is it over? And B, did you think about, like, do we have the distance yet to know what this meant? And how did that come into the assembling and the writing of this?
Well, it's not over yet. There are plenty of people out there with long COVID. There are families still suffering from terrible losses. And I think that the toxic politics of our time was made more toxic by COVID, right? There are all sorts of trends of polarization, lack of trust, and all sorts of things that were hitting the US and the world going into COVID. COVID accelerated all of them, I think. So I think that's front and center. COVID's not over yet. And I didn't want to declare it over. And I frankly felt that to write a total history of COVID was beyond me, that I'm not an epidemiologist. It would take too long to learn the history of medicine. I would be better off focusing on what I know something about, which is work and oral history. I've written about that before, and a place that I know, New York City, because we were, for a while, the world epicenter of the pandemic.
Yeah, there's definitely elements of New York City that come alive when you're, like when you're on the subway and you're like, what's the story behind the person next to me? There's some element of reading Rob's book and you're like, oh, that's probably the story of the guy next to me. So I just wanted to, I asked all of you to go back to 5 years ago and where you were. Rob, I'm just gonna ask you to do that personally. What was your pandemic like? How did you shut down? Where did you spend it? What were you thinking?
I stayed at home with my wife, Clara Hemphill. She's great company.
She's also here.
I did a lot of writing. I did a lot of reading. One of our kids moved in with us for a while. But I stayed in the back room of the apartment. And I went out late at night by myself. I didn't want to be out when there were other people around. But I remember vividly that when I went out late at night, it was nice when it was quiet, but it wasn't really quiet that much because I would hear sirens all the time. And that would get me thinking about what was going on in the calls and the people who were working on the ambulances. I didn't ride subways, I didn't ride buses. I walked very long distances. I sort of shrunk my world as small as possible to make the smallest possible target for the virus.
Yeah. Did you see Manhattan differently as someone who knows the history of this borough in a way that I think many of us don't or can't say we are?
It was a strange landscape. It was a landscape without people. And what makes New York vibrant is people and the interaction between people. And when I went out, I didn't see any people. So in a funny way, what the book does is it repopulates the city of New York after it emptied out during COVID.
Yeah, I think it's a really important aspect of like what everyone was going through, right, as they were going through it. And there's an aspect of what you said, which is kind of turning story and agency over to the people. And so 5 years ago, I was at CNN, and it's the biggest of the biggest news websites in the world, right? And so for me, there was this feeling of populating the internet every morning, but feeling incredibly alone, even as I'm caregiving for my father and my kids are remote schooling and, oh Lord. And then my neighborhood of Jackson Heights is definitely the sirens like defined our neighborhood, right? And there was such a disconnect between the internet, which is like kind of where my background in national media and digital strategy, and I think it's like a lot of us, like we sort of get our news there, and this is where we're spending a lot of our day just because of information and you know, like who doesn't have a web browser up the whole day? And yet, what I was experiencing and what people were turning to me for, such as, where do I get a COVID test? Or, you know, somebody just died at Elmhurst Hospital and he's undocumented and we need to figure out getting the remains or the body or just getting him a funeral. We didn't know who else to call. And so there was just such a disconnect between what CNN was covering every day and then sort of my personal reality and then what people were turning to each other for, which I think comes through in your book as well, of kind of this idea of turning to each other and essential workers being the ones that had a lot of answers for us. And so I just share that because Epicenter was born out of that feeling of we're not actually being served by the biggest of the big right now. And what if the answer is, I'm calling you for a need or advice, and sort of this idea, again, of turning over. So for me, it became turning over my news agenda, our news agenda, to the people who are articulating what's needed. And so there's just something really that I feel honored by co-sponsoring this tonight, because 5 years ago, I did not have, and perhaps I still don't have the vocabulary to explain what essential workers did for us, but also came to change completely how I see what our news agenda should be every day, which I think in these times really is something that we should reflect on, right? Who is setting that, and how do we know it's true and rooted in what people actually need?
For me, the defining experience of the pandemic, which came back to me when I actually got COVID for the first time late in 2021, even though I'd been vaccinated, right? But, okay, was not knowing who to trust and who to talk to. And I tested positive for COVID. I knew two people who worked at high levels in public health. They both said, get Paxlovid immediately. I called my physician and said, you know, I've got COVID. I'd like a prescription for Paxlovid. And he said, you got a fever? And I said, no. Hey, you don't need it. I said, you know, I'm really feeling bad. I'm actually feeling like I'm going off a cliff. And two other people told me I should get it. And he shrugged and said, you could hear him shrug over the phone. You know, he said, all right, you want it, I'll write out a prescription for you. But it took me back to the very early days when you didn't know what to do, you didn't know what to believe, and you felt like you were entirely on your own. And that was a really bad feeling, because I think it's really hard for people to know who to trust in those circumstances, and it really isolates you in very, very damaging ways.
And so what did you end up doing?
Oh, I got Paxlovid.
Yeah.
You know, and I felt better. And, you know, the famous sour aftertaste, I had some peppermint drops. It wasn't so bad. I felt better.
Yeah, and I think like communities like that form. So I'm just thinking there was a doctor that called Epicenter and said, you know, my career is kind of at the end. If you just need someone to like go to people's houses and get them vaccinated, I don't really care who busts me for it. I can do it. You know, like there was that type of showing up. And he was a big Paxlovid advocate. And he would say, if someone's doctor doesn't know the latest research, like I am as up to date as it gets. I mean, he really was a phenomenal doctor. He unfortunately has passed since then. But and so these kind of networks were rooted in who you trust and who was showing up in that way, which I don't even know if I should share that, because that feels not scientific or fact-based, although I swear he was scientific and fact-based.
Yeah. No, and people did mutual aid projects in neighborhoods. Right. I mean, there's a guy in Queens who's in the book, Kleber Vera, and you know, he was working as a hairdresser when the pandemic started, so he couldn't work in public. He started cutting hair out in parks when you could finally go out, and then with an LGBTQ organization in Queens, put together a project collecting food and clothing and distributing it to people all around Queens. And he was thrilled to do this. You know, a woman who's got a photograph in the book, Elena Martinez, She didn't know what to do. She was frustrated. She and her friends got together and started going around the city putting up memorials to the dead. In every borough, they would put up a memorial in a prominent place where people had died. And that felt like a response at a time when the White House was trying to deny the number of dead, and social distancing practices meant you couldn't have anything like a normal funeral. Elena and the women from Naming the Lost were out there putting up memorials, mourning people in the different boroughs, and it gave them a sense of agency.
There's also a localization of it, I think, that you're getting to, which is, and I think about this at CNN, for example, the standard line was, ask your doctor, right? And so this is a case where Rob's asking his doctor. In Jackson Heights, we discovered 42% of Latinos, thanks to a survey done by a gentleman in the audience, Harlem Gunnis, in public health, found that 42% of Latinos in Elmhurst, Jackson Heights, and Corona don't have a primary care doctor. And so our answer of go ask your doctor is telling you to seek information out of something that you don't have, right? And so I'm just thinking of your kind of homegrown solutions that you're narrating as something that the whole city had to turn to. Rob, I just wondered if we could get another taste of some of the book, because a lot of the elements, if we look back on them 5 years later, it feels like they were kind of back to the future or predicting what we're in now. I don't know if that's what you'll read, but I'm thinking of one in particular.
One of the people I met doing this research, I met through the Queens Memory Project. Queens was central because of Elmhurst and the high rates of infection there and high rates of death. And it's fitting that a nurse from Queens who was working at a hospital in Manhattan did heroic work. Her name is Patricia Tew. She's from Queens originally, and she worked at New York Presbyterian on the East Side in really difficult circumstances, really, really difficult circumstances. And then she went home at night and made homemade videos with a phone and posted them on the web to tell nurses what they could expect when they went into work, to buck them up so they'd be prepared to face what they had to face. So I'll read a short excerpt from Patricia, recorded on April 6th of 2020, when things were just about peaking in New York City and about 800 people were dying every day. The last time I spoke, I said New York City was on fire. Well, welcome to hell, because we are basically at the gates of hell. We are very close to the tipping point, reaching the peak. We're almost there. We haven't reached it yet. I have accepted the fact that our government, our president, and no one is coming to help. So New York, it's just us. No one is coming to help us. And working in the ICU, the number one goal is basically to save as many lives as possible. Everybody's dying, and you're just doing your best to keep every single one of those people alive. Every minute that I have gone into work, you are working at like 150%. You don't even have time to think your own thoughts. You do everything you can to make sure they're breathing. The one thing I really feel is anger, and I'm angry. We are in war. You know New York is in war when we're by ourselves, and I've accepted that, but I'm never going to forget anything that's happening here. The nurses are being spread so thin, so thin. What they're asking for us to do is beyond God's work. We're going to keep fighting. It's our city, so just keep spreading awareness, stay inside. I stepped out today to do some groceries and errands, and it's amazing to see how many people are still outside, walking around, even with no mask, acting like nothing happened. I just don't understand. And we are not in the worst yet. These next 2 weeks are going to be brutal, like brutal. I'm telling you. And no one is coming. No one is coming to help. So for all my nurses, hang in there. Stay strong. Have each other's back. Don't be afraid. This is a very scary situation. It's a very anxious situation. Be smart about things, but don't be afraid. If anything, be angry, and let the anger fight, because I'm angry. She survived the pandemic and sat down a couple months later just to say some final reflections about the work she did. I'll just read a little bit from it. The nurses that I work with every day, I'm extremely proud of them. Everyone stepped up. Every single one of those nurses took initiative and didn't say no. It makes me so proud to be a nurse. Our nurses acted as not just registered nurses, they acted as doctors, they acted as respiratory therapists, they acted as the nursing assistants, they acted like the cleaning services. We emptied out our own garbage, we cleaned our own floors. Nurses and medical staff are really superheroes. I'm genuinely proud of all the nurses that I've stepped up with during this time because it was not easy. They really did the impossible. The clapping at 7 p.m. really made me feel good. You may have a nurse who had such a crappy shift. Patients might have died on their shift, and as they're walking out, they hear somebody cheering. It makes a difference. It uplifts the spirit.
You mentioned the cheering. What do you make of that now? The cheering, of course, the 7 p.m. clanging of the pots, people just making noise in our neighborhood in Jackson Heights. People would kind of pull out other musical instruments. I mean, it was a real show of support, not just for New York and kind of this solidarity, but really an assertion of support for essential workers.
It was an assertion of support for essential workers, and it was also an act of sustenance for the people who looked out the windows and cheered and saw other people. You went from being isolated in your apartment throughout the day to, maybe 20 minutes at 7 p.m., you realized you were part of a larger city with other people. I remember a woman who lives diagonally across the street from me in an upper story. We would wave to each other sometimes. I've never met her before. I've never met her since. But I think that affirmed both the essential workers and the people who's doing the cheering. What's troubling to me is not much has been done for essential workers since, right? There are a couple bills before the state legislature aimed at getting funding and money to the families and survivors, which I think is a great idea. There's also legislation before the legislature talking about getting memorials built to COVID. I think all these are worthwhile projects. I'm just wondering, is Joshua Fletcher here? Are you here? He's right here. His father died. He was a transit worker, and his mom gave me one of the most heroic interviews that we had in the whole book, and talked about Trevor Fletcher, his dad's heroic work and his passing, and talk to him after this tonight. Anybody who wants to be involved in either the legislature or the memorial process, because he's in the middle of it.
Thank you for that. What were some of the other untold stories? You've mentioned transit workers, which I'm really glad you're calling out because I haven't seen, I haven't seen this back to back in the way that your book kind of delves into what happened to subway workers and bus drivers and so forth. Are there other, as you kind of put all these together, other trends, other untold stories that emerged?
Transit workers were really hidden.
Why do you think that is?
I think they are, along with sanitation workers, they are the most invisible public sector workers in the city of New York, but they're even more invisible than sanitation workers. Think about it. Cops, New York's finest. Firefighters, New York's bravest. Sanitation workers, New York's strongest. What's the nickname for transit workers? There is none. They are treated as invisible, and they don't get any attention. In the end, the Transit Authority commissioned a website. The last time I looked, there's 130 dead transit workers commemorated on that website. They commissioned a poem in honor of the transit workers. I'm touched by all of that. But if there's ways to help the families, that's something to really pursue, because there are lots of survivors whose lives are scarred by the deaths of relatives, parents, loved ones in COVID. And they're still hurting, and there are lots of people with long COVID. We're still groping with that.
You kind of alluded to this, where is the cheering now, right? How are we treating essential workers now? Do you want to answer that? Do you kind of look at this moment we're in? It's a largely, at least in New York City, a workforce that's majority minority, although we're in a city that, is majority minority, largely immigrant, right? And this moment we're in, all of that feel like a way of life feels under attack. Are those two things connected? COVID and this moment that we're in?
Yeah, I mean, for starters, if you look at the history of New York City, if you look at the city in the 80s and 90s, when New York seemed to be really in crisis, it was just beginning to recover from the population losses of the 70s. Its economy was still finding its legs. It was immigration and immigrant labor that powerfully helped New York City recover from the urban crisis years, right? I just think that's a fact at all levels of the economy. The economy and the city gets so prosperous that it becomes really, really expensive to live here. And so many immigrants wind up living in overcrowded housing with 2, 3 generations inside one apartment. That is the tinder that in neighborhoods in Queens and Brooklyn sets up the forest fire that COVID will become. So in a horrible way, the death tolls in immigrant neighborhoods, again, in Queens and Brooklyn, parts of Manhattan as well, are a terrible kick in the pants for the people whose labor sustained the city and helped it come back after some of its hardest years. And I think we need to face that, and we're not really facing it very clearly yet.
Just say more on that. Hardest hit economically and didn't recover from that. Politically, you all clapped for us for a few months and then kind of forgot who we were. Like, is it all of the above? What part of the gap do you think gets us to where we're at today?
The gap is getting public recognition, because it's really interesting to compare the response to 9/11 and the response to COVID. 5 years out from 9/11, we had lots of memorials, and we had the beginnings of discussions about a big memorial. A memorial's not the only thing, but in 9/11, there was a terrible loss of life among first responders, but they're uniformed, they're recognized by the city, they have a constituency. So many of the dead in COVID lack that kind of public constituency that would keep their stories foregrounded, that could lobby for them. Having that alone doesn't solve the problem. More firefighters have died of complications since 9/11 than died on 9/11. That's a horrible thought when you think about it. But I think the workforce in COVID, particularly the black and brown workers who were out in the city working as essential workers and frontline workers in COVID, they are in a more vulnerable position because they lack that big constituency to lobby for them, the way other constituencies had after 9/11.
What do you think the appropriate memorial could be? Or are there several ideas here?
I don't think there's one memorial that would do justice to everything. There were so many experiences that I think you need to recognize the plurality of experiences. So you should, if we get to memorial making it COVID, you should be able to go to different places in the city and be reminded in a memorial or a plaque of what happened here during that time. I'm thinking of Elmhurst Hospital. When you walk past Elmhurst Hospital, you should see something there, right? As to what a memorial might look like, the best one to me would prompt in the viewer the existential question that every essential worker had to ask when they went to work during COVID. Do I go into work today, or do I not go into work today? Do I go into that hospital bedroom? Do I not go into that hospital bedroom? Do I go into that apartment? Do I not go into that apartment? And get people to think about that decision that people had to make over and over and over again. Workers drew on very different sentiments to make that choice. Stephen Palmer's here tonight. He's a medical researcher at New York Presbyterian, and he said something really profound when we were talking about this. When he was in difficult situations in COVID, as part of his team, he told me that I just was not going to be the only one to think out. If everybody was going in, I was going to go with them. Richard Brea, who commanded a police precinct in the Bronx, told me that some of his officers didn't want to go into apartments or houses where people had COVID. And he said to them, this is no different from a gun job. This is no different from a burglary in progress. You swore an oath when you became a police officer that you would face danger to protect the public, and this is no different. And he led them in, and he put on a mask, and he showed them how to do it by his own example. People drew on many different resources, inner resources, to face that danger. I think that's an important thing to recognize.
Yeah, and you also mentioned the Queen's Memory Project as a part of the gathering of stories, and we've worked with them, and I feel like that in the moment, and even years later, was aware of what we were going through and serves as a bit of a capsule. The other that Epicenter has worked with at Greenwood Cemetery, we were part of a Naming the Lost project. Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, sure.
So we actually asked our audiences, like, did you lose someone? And it could be anyone, because there was COVID, and then, what I also learned, having written about and trying to memorialize some of the dead, was it was actually really hard to get COVID declared on a death certificate, right? And so, we just asked people to share loss during this period, and they did an art installation around it, which was quite beautiful. And if you haven't been to Greenwood Cemetery, it's this beautiful juxtaposition of death and life, because it's just so truly green and a great place to walk around and on a beautiful day. So that was one other project. It comes up more, and you also mentioned the children who've been orphaned, right? The people who lost their parents, and certainly in school systems that comes up a lot. So I think this idea that you walk around the city and you can't miss what was taken is quite profound in the way that you laid that out. We've gotten through 45 minutes of discussion, and I have not mentioned Donald Trump. But now I am.
Yeah. So two things came through in the.
I didn't even ask a question. Do you see what happened there?
When I was reading the interviews conducted during 2020, one thing became really clear. People were furious at Donald Trump. And I said to myself, boy, well, that guy will never get a vote again, ever again in New York City. If you had told me in 2020 that he would get more votes in 2024 than he got in 2020, I would not have believed you. But I think it's a testament to how people have forgotten things. I think it's also a testament to a general, I'm angry, I'm going to lash out, I'll vote for the most outlandish character I can come up with, and that'll be Donald Trump, and he'll throw the bums out, and he'll make everything right. In 2020, people were so angry at him. It comes through on the interviews. And Biden's inauguration, looked in most neighborhoods, and I rode around Manhattan that day. It sort of looked like the liberation of Paris in World War II. People were pouring out onto the streets, they were cheering and things like that. So we've come a long way from 2020, and we've forgotten some things that we held quite dear in 2020, and I wonder what we'll forget moving forward and what we'll remember in the future. That I can't predict. The higher vote total for Donald Trump in 24 than in 20 was surprising enough for me. That's enough surprises.
And you didn't think it was foreshadowed because the anger was towards Donald Trump as opposed to just anger at general systems?
It was him again and again and again. People just said it again and again and again. I deliberately muted my own voice in the book because I wanted the narrators' voices to stand up for a long time. People will, I hope, read this book 50 years from now, and it's not important that they learn what I thought. It's important that they learn what the people who speak in this book thought. And one of the peer reviewers who looked at the manuscript said to me, Rob, you don't need your own sentiments on Donald Trump. Let the narrators speak. Let them say it. It's far more compelling if you leave it to them.
Yeah, the part that to me felt eye-opening was about 2 years ago. So Epicenter's history, as you might imagine, very celebratory of immigrants. We live here, our staff are children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. It's a majority people of color staff. But a few years ago, what started to surprise me was in our neighborhoods, these are immigrant neighborhoods, the anti-immigrant sentiment, right? And so there was a lot of language around, I came here the right way, from Asian immigrants, Latino immigrants. There was a lot of, I never got a hotel room when I came, and so we almost had to educate our audiences on, well, let's unpack what the right way to come into America is. What are the right ways? Seeking asylum in the United States is a perfectly legal way to enter the United States, right? And so it was just kind of getting into the semantics. But I didn't see that captured in mainstream media, and also just, I kind of thought, oh, this is like unique to our neighborhoods, and then you start to see trends. And so over the last few months, that has definitely been picked up upon, I think.
Yeah, no, John Mollenkoff, taught here for many years, has been looking at this. He's not yet finished with the research, but he's starting to think about it. He thinks there were a combination of two things. Democratic votes were depressed because there was a lot of disappointment with the Biden administration, but there was an anger in some quarters with the status quo that expressed itself in slightly higher vote totals for Donald Trump. Remember, Kamala Harris carried New York City. It's not like Trump won the city.
That's right.
But he did better here than he had 4 years ago. That was surprising.
And the other aspect was businesses, just, the number of small businesses that closed or felt like they were struggling for the last few years. And that feels another kind of, when you talk about anger, that feels like another strain and uncertainty that's quite palpable, although I would argue it's grown even more uncertain over the last few weeks. Of the Trump administration. How do we support essential workers now?
Well, I think the kind of people who do the work that was deemed essential in COVID deserve usually better pay, better health care, better housing, all these things. I mean, they're often working close to the margins, to begin with. And I think it's as a general proposition, in New York City, as it gets more and more unequal, the people who work in working class occupations are more and more strained. So there's one thing that really bothered me about the pandemic overall, was it just highlighted the terrible inequalities in our city. I mean, I knew they were there. I had already written a book about immigration, and it was one of the big themes, that the ironic reward for immigrant labor restoring New York to prosperity was a level of inequality that made it harder for many immigrants to live in New York. So I think that, for me, the really deeply disturbing thing about COVID was the inequalities that it exposed, grounded in housing conditions and access to health care. And wages that just not enough to get by on for most people. They spend a huge proportion of their income in rent.
Yeah, you mentioned housing. I was at a conference last week of the National Capital Reinvestment Coalition, which some of you might be familiar with. It's a lot of community banks around the country. And housing of essential workers and farm labor has become something that a lot of municipalities have taken up and really made very essential as a part of their policy and working with community banks, which, there's one part of New York City where it's like, oh, it's so big, would we do that here? There was another part that kind of made me think, why not, right? We do a lot of work around housing and just making the information around lotteries and affordable housing available as an information layer that we're providing to our audiences. But the kind of critique we get, which isn't really it's not as much a critique of us as it is of the systems, is that there's just never enough, right? The lottery will help 5 people, and we see that there are thousands of people trying to navigate that system that we're putting out there.
Once upon a time in New York City, roughly from the 50s to the 70s, when the labor movement was stronger, New York City built housing for middle-income people, it must be said, that was deliberately affordable. There was an outfit called the United Housing Foundation did this. And we've had panels here at the Gotham Center and elsewhere about how might we replicate something like this, building large amounts of housing that's designed to be affordable forever, right? And I think that's an important project for New York City, where we have a heroic past to learn from. We have a great history of building affordable housing. We need to learn from it and apply it again.
Right, if only clanging our pots outside was enough, right? I'm going to ask you to do one more reading, but before we get to that, how has this work affected you personally?
At first, I just thought of it as my job. I had volunteered to do it. A borough historian is a voluntary position. I thought it would be interesting to do. Some of the interviews I edited were really hard to read. I think of Phil's interview, right? And sometimes I would always ask someone if they were interested in having the interview in a book before I edited it. And if they said yes, then I'd say, I'm going to edit it, and then I'm going to send it to you. And then sometimes it would take a while for people to get back to me. And they'd say, wow, I just read the edited version of the interview, and it's accurate to what I said, but I had forgotten all that stuff, right? So it was bringing up all sorts of things for them. And then I interviewed Joshua's mom about the passing of Joshua's dad, Trevor Fletcher, and it was heartbreaking. This was a guy who loved his job. He loved being a transit worker. He loved working on buses. And his wife's interview was a memorial to him. And in the middle of the interview, she started crying, and I started crying. And I said to her, do you want to stop? And she said, no, I want to finish this. So we finished the interview, and it's in the book. And it's very loving, but it's also very candid about what it's like when somebody's passing from COVID. Late in the process of the book, my wife asked me, does it have an impact on you that you spend all the day in the back of our apartment in a dark room editing interviews where it's always the spring of 2020? I said, this is a really good question. And I thought about it. And the irony is that the interviews from the spring of 2020, as difficult as they were to work on, were also the most inspiring. They were about people being brave in difficult circumstances. They were about people reinventing their jobs. Two of the doctors at New York Presbyterian, Chris Tedeschi, and then another doctor who prefers to be anonymous, said this. Usually hospital work is top down. We worked bottom up. We reinvented our jobs. We came up with new procedures. We called people in other parts of the country. We set up Zoom conversations to develop new ways of treating people. And for me, that was inspiring, because that was not just courage, but it was brilliant public service of a kind that you don't see very often, you know, in the most dire circumstances. So it was tough on me after a while. I didn't really think about it until I was almost done, but I took sustenance from those interviews in the darkest days because I think they were inspiring.
Thank you so much for being with us. Rob, go ahead, Rob. Yeah, oh.
Thank all of you, and especially thank you all contributors, and especially the contributors that are here tonight.
And the contributors, that's right. I was gonna, just one last thing. If you are in the book, could you just raise your hand so we see who you are? Okay, thank you.